Welcome to Creative. I'm your host, Andy Baker, and this show is located at the nexus of creativity and technology. Each episode, I sit down with creatives of all kinds, artists, writers, musicians, designers, directors, you name it, to explore how artificial intelligence is shaping their creative process. How did they get started using AI tools? Where are they now in that relationship? And what do they really think about AI and creation? Let's dive in. In this conversation, Jesse Alexander, writer and producer on a few shows you may have heard of, like Alias, Lost, Heroes, and Hannibal, shares his insights on the integration of AI in the creative process. He discusses his journey experimenting with AI, the importance of conversational interactions with it, and how these tools can empower creatives of all kinds. Jesse emphasizes the need for writers to adapt to the changing landscape of the industry, where traditional pathways are evolving, and the role of visionaries remains crucial. He encourages creators to embrace AI and to focus on making their own content, because making shit is what it's all about. I love talking shop with Jesse, and I know you're going to get a lot out of this episode. So let's dive in. All right, so I'm on here with Jesse Alexander, who has credits that anyone would envy, incredibly talented guy. So Jesse, if you could introduce yourself to our listeners, tell us a little bit about everything that leads up to now, but then we're going to focus on the now because you're doing some really interesting exploration into AI, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Thank you very much, Andy. I appreciate it. I am so excited to be here. I'm a TV writer primarily, but I also write video games, and I've been lucky to be doing this for a long time. TV shows, I have done Alias, Lost, Heroes, Hannibal, Star Trek Discovery, American Gods Season 2, Citadel, a few others in between. I wrote a movie, Eight-Legged Freaks. I do work on Valorant, a video game for Riot Games, helping them build out their world and their lore and do some of the cinematics with them. And I, have always dabbled in gaming. Like my first game job I ever had as a writer back in like the early 90s was a video game with Bruce Willis for Activision called Apocalypse. And since then, I've always tried to keep one foot in games, and technology is something that has been a huge part of my life. I was that generation that was like 10 years old when, Star Wars came out and the Apple II computer and basic programming, and then Dungeons and Dragons came out around the same era, and Atari 2600. So I had the
you're
good
just
fortune.
Describing my entire youth right there.
Yeah, I had the good fortune to be, born at an awesome time and be the right age when all this sweet stuff came out. And it tracked with my career where I was sort of that first generation that had been exposed to all that stuff as kind of a native. And so it was a huge part of all my writing and just the way that I thought, and it has really helped me have longevity in my career.
Yeah, you mentioned Dungeons and Dragons and sort of being just immersive story, right? And emergent storytelling. I too work in video games, and one of the projects that I worked on, this thing called Universe, basically it's lore and world building, and the expansiveness of video games has entranced me since I was young. And believe it or not, I played Apocalypse. I played that game a lot. I loved that it was Bruce Willis. I was a big Bruce Willis fan at the time and still am. But I found that a number of the people that I've spoken with who are screenwriters or artists, but people who worked in the video game world are often ones who gravitate to what's the latest technology, what are the tools, what's available, what are people doing at the cutting edge, because you can't step into the video game world where they're not playing around with that. And so that leads us to, as much as I desperately would love to talk to you about Lost and Hannibal and some of my favorite shows, what brings us here today, outside of the fact of wanting to ask you why you call your website Scribble Jerk, is your blog that you have there. And what you're covering there is very much a deep dive and an exploration about AI in the creative process. And I'm really curious so you've worked in a bazillion writers' rooms. You've gone through the process, the hard work, the discovery. And at some point in there, you started becoming aware of AI tools, of the possibilities, what was out there. And I'm curious sort of how that landed on your radar and sort of how you decided to become an adopter and that experimentation.
Yeah, that experimentation and adoption of technology and process and stuff has always been a part of what I've done. I was lucky enough to get to do a lot of transmedia content for the TV shows that I did, like Alias, Lost, Heroes, and some of the others as well. And then do some consulting for LucasArts on some projects. And one of my buddies at LucasArts, who now I work with him at Riot Games on Valorant, and he was telling me a couple of years ago that I really should take a look at AI. And that was right when ChatGPT dropped, I think. And I went and checked it out, and I was seeing, people are doing these prompts. So I prompted it to be me because I figured I have some kind of presence and have worked on content that it's familiar with, theoretically, because it's ripping everything off. And so I primed it to be me, and then I just said, hey, thanks for coming into ABC Studios today, Jesse. We're excited to hear. So you have 5 ideas for a new TV show for us? And I just hit return, and it pitched me like 5 shows. And I was like, holy crap. So I just played the role of the executive and just kept drilling down through this thing and asking it, all these different questions about the show, and then casting and dialogue, and, what would the video game look? How much should people get paid? And it was crazy, and just went down this rabbit hole. And I just freaked out, and I created this big file, and I shared it with all my friends. And it was like, you guys, you have to see this thing, because this is what it can do right now. So many people are talking about, and this was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And so many people are talking about it's this thing. I hear about this thing. And I was like, this is really, really, really solid. And so ever since then, I just have been fooling around with it constantly. A lot of it, on my blog, using it to, clean up prose, or, do sample or look up specific details about movie references. And then I started to, the more I learned about it, the more I started to find ways to incorporate it into my creative process. And I just did a blog post about it, because the epiphany that I had was, holy crap, for essentially my career in TV, 20 years, I was kind of an LLM, right? I was sitting in a writer's room, and a showrunner would come in and they'd say hey, I have an idea kind of like this. And I would go, oh, well, if it's that, then what about this, this, and this? And they'd say, oh, I like that one. Well, if you like that one, this, 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 this. And they say, that sounds really good. Could you take a crack at that? And then bring it back, and then I bring it back, and then, they would rewrite it. So I realized, I should just interact with this thing as if I'm a showrunner and just talk to it conversationally. And because I had domain expertise in screenwriting after doing it for 30 years, I knew what questions to ask and how to evaluate the responses that I was getting. And I also had a real clear sense of workflows in terms of, building narratives, building IP, building characters. So I had really solid frame of reference as I would work with it to kind of figure out what its strengths and stretches were. And again, that's kind of where I'm at, and just been messing around with it.
And what's fascinating, and I want to dive in on so many of the points you just made, but one of which is, that training it to be you, right? There's a tool out there called LoRA. I talked to an artist, and he had actually had a car accident. He's going to make a full recovery, but right now he's got a slight tremor in the hand that he draws with. So he's taking this time to feed his entire body of work into this system, and he can create new work based on his style, his approach, and it knows him. He feels like he's established this relationship where it's okay, I'm going to be doing the main part of the painting, but you can work on the cherubs, oh apprentice, and feed me some art that I can then feed back into you, but it knows my style. But one of the things that you talked about there, the ability to talk to the AI conversationally or interact with it. And one of the things in looking over, the stuff that you've written that I was blown away by was the level of detail in your prompting. The thought that goes into, given all that I know about the process of screenwriting, I am going to talk to you and give you these parameters, and just the length and detail in your prompts to get it to give you the feedback that you're looking for, so that it has, guardrails, structures to work in. And like you, the ability to say and have it pivot. I did the same sort of process and still do, where it's like, okay, I have this idea. You are AI, ChatGPT. You are a writer's room. There's 10 writers in here. Some of them are good with action. Some are good with character. All right, kick this idea around for a while and show me what you're talking about and what you're thinking about. All right, now break it and outline together. Now you are the producer who's going to give some studio notes. Okay, no studio notes go to the showrunner. You're the showrunner now. What do you think about those notes? What do you push back on? What do you keep? And how are you going to implement them? And it is fascinating that it's good. And so when you've gone through this process and you started this 2 years ago and it's gotten better over the 2 years, have you continued to have these holy shit moments where it's increasingly sort of catching up, more nuanced and more skillful?
Yeah, I think, as anyone who plays in this space knows, I would say every 72 hours, right? You're probably like, oh shit, that's cool. Like, there's some new thing. Another thing too that was really cool that again just worked out for me is like over one hiatus, some years back, I had been reading this book about memorization. I think it was Josh Waitzkin wrote it. And then I was also reading the Checklist Manifesto by, I think is Atul Gawande or something. And just for the heck of it, I came up with, it's sort of a checklist, but it was also a mnemonic of kind of everything that I knew about screenwriting and everything that I'd heard in writers' rooms. And I still write it out by hand, a few times a week. I used to do it multiple times a day. Villain's goal affects the hero, conflict, all these things, so that when AI came out, I had all this stuff top of mind. So I knew to ask it about mystery and nemesis, relatable and relevant, and had very, very, very specific questions that I could ask it because I had memorized them in the same way that the AI does. Another benefit that I had in my experiments is because I've been writing for, I've had a professional career for 30 years, which is so absurd to say because I still feel like I'm a 13-year-old kid playing with a Super 8 camera. But, and even that, I'd been writing even before I started working. So I had this massive backlog of unproduced scripts and pilots and ideas and just tons of my own content that I could use with have it go through and do different things to and try to pull things out. And so I could run tons and tons of different experiments, which again was very valuable because I had such a good grasp of the material that I was using. I guess I was training it on that stuff, but I really thought of it as just doing these different experiments with it. And that has been really amazing and helpful. One of the earliest things I did was I had a screenplay that I'd written that I hadn't sold, and I told it to turn it into a prose format, right? And because I'm like, I'm not going to freaking learn how to write prose. I'm a man of a certain age. Like, I got to write, so I'm not going to go through this. And it did a really pretty good job, which was kind of amazing. And then I dumped it into 11 Labs and had 11 Labs do like an audiobook version of like the first couple chapters. And this was like over a year ago. And I was like, and I was listening to it, I was like, oh, this is pretty good. Like, oh my God, this is actually, and it was things like that that are they're really proof of concept, where you realize, holy shit, if this can do this now, forget about it, right? It's just going to be able to crush stuff moving forward. Yeah. And then, as the person you were describing about how they kind of were using it to overcome their physical issue that they were having. I was diagnosed very late in life, like around 45, with like ADHD, to the point where the doctor was like, you have a job? Like, you're married? And he was pretty surprised. And I kind of started to be able to see that's why there are things that I have in my head and I'm telling them to people and I think I'm making sense, but I'm not making sense when I'm saying them out loud. And it's been great for me to be able to dictate into AI and then have it, spit that back out in a more coherent form. So it's kind of like, so what you're trying to say is X. Because it really does help me overcome that issue. That I think a lot. Again, everybody has their thing that they can use AI to help them overcome or improve or support, and that's another really cool thing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. And one of the things that I think part of this podcast is about education, informing people who have started to dabble, but you clearly have you've played with them enough where in this latest post, you talk about the nuance of this is what I would use ChatGPT for. This is what I use Perplexity for. Claude has certain skills. Can you give us a rapid fire breakdown? So any writer who's listening to this and saying like, okay, I want to incorporate a tool or experiment with a tool, where should they begin? And what are the relative strengths? They can read the blog, but I'm curious to hear it from you, like how you got to that understanding that if you want a good, wild idea or a clean, polished, this is the direction you go.
Yeah, a lot of it is, and I just sort of kind of came up with that and put up that post a couple of days ago, and it just comes from experimentation and then looking at how my workflow has evolved. I do a lot of walking. I take 3 walks a day. Each walk is 2.5 miles, and beginning, middle, end of day. And on those walks, I'll dictate or riff with different AIs. And so if I'm interested in some topic, I'll ask Perplexity to see what it can find, because it'll come up with something pretty quickly. It'll give me a short little, here's a little gloss on the topic. And if I like it, then I'll dump it into ChatGPT to expand on that idea and go deeper on that idea. And I'll iterate on whatever it has in there. And then I will put it into Gemini for an evaluation of what I have. And often I will use Gemini to check accuracy, plagiarism, all those things, which I sort of do with all of them in different sequence. And then after Gemini, I go into Claude for like full on writing, because I have a bunch of different projects set up in Claude. And I have one that is trained on samples of stuff that I've written, and then has templates for different things that I need, like scenes or characters or pitches. And then, I'll get something out of Claude that I can then polish myself and play with. But, very often too, I'll just on my toolbar on my browser, I have them all. And often I'll dump the same prompt into all of them and just see what they come up with.
It's a competition, people.
It's kind of like playing an instrument, or it really is just, you don't have to. Look, I have paid plans. I don't have the $200 plan. That seems a little extreme, but I have the paid plans, so I'm not usually limited too heavily. And even when I get limited by using one, then I'll just switch to another one. The main thing is I just think people need to just start messing around with them. And it's why in this one blog post that I put up is about trying to identify what is your domain that you have real expertise in. What's a domain that you know so much about that you're very comfortable talking about it, asking questions about it, and you can identify the quality of the responses that you're getting from these different LLMs. Honestly, not worrying too much about the prompting, about like, oh, I have to structure the prompt in this exact special way. Like, it's like, just freaking talk to the thing. And that was another huge epiphany for me, is just being conversational with it. Like I drove out to Las Vegas for a Star Trek convention where I was on a panel of, and I had the ChatGPT audio thing on and just riffed with it the whole way out, and just was so collaborative and fun and, again, conversational. And I think that one of the incredible things about these today is that it can parse your desire and your intended outcome, even if what you're giving it is a pretty rough mess of rambling chatter. So I just wish more people weren't so intimidated by the empty box and just not knowing what to do with it. And, I remember, I have another blog post that I'm working on about that, about technology. Like, I remember when we first got Dungeons and Dragons, and my mom brought it home, and it was this box, and it didn't really have any instructions. We weren't really sure what to do with it. So we kind of just like made up our own rules. And the same when you got like a computer back in the very early days, you would, I just remember staring at the Apple II and like, what exactly am I supposed to do with this thing? And thank God now for YouTube and the internet, where you get to have people showing you how they're using these things, and you can have some examples of what people are doing to get started.
It's fascinating in that when you say conversational, some of the little moments where when you start to do that, you have those little moments where it's like, wait a minute, do you have any questions for me, ChatGPT? I've given you a bunch of information. We're talking about this, and I'm trying to get to the heart of this character, doing a character bio for a Bible or whatever. And, what I'm getting, isn't quite there. Like, do you have any questions for me that might help clarify? And then it spits out these really great questions. And it's like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. That ability to, it wants to converse. And in the sense of like, I'm giving you, based on everything that you have told me, this is what I can come up with. But if you tell me a little more in these areas, then we might get what you're intending. That's what you were saying. Have you played with NotebookLM at all?
Well, yeah, it's awesome. It's super cool. I haven't played with it it's a slightly newer product. I've played with it a little bit. I have this thing that I'm messing. Again, I'm a nerd, dude. I'm a freaking nerd, and I'm like a nerd about story and writing and words. And I've always thought about, I could never code, and I think it was because of my ADD and dyslexia and stuff. I could just never get the code to work and to run and stuff. So, but I've always been really interested in deconstructing everything. And so I read every book about writing, and, I know so much about different story structures and sequences and stuff. So I was playing with this thing, a new way to structure, new way to take apart a 3-act structure using the 8 sequences, and then breaking that into a quadrilogy within of four shorts, because it just was feeling to me that in a world where no one reads anymore, like trying to write these huge screenplays, and it just was not time well spent. So I was thinking, like, could you break the structure down of a feature so that as you're writing these, traditional acts, each one of them kind of works as a standalone? Like, could you think of each act as its own, movie or animated short or whatever it's going to be? So I kind of came up with this, quadrilogy within theory, and had so much gobbledygook about it that I didn't really understand and couldn't totally explain it. So I put it into NotebookLM, and I had that podcast thing talk about it in a way that was very insightful and enlightening for me and really helpful for me to understand it, which I don't know. Now I think this sounds sort of idiotic that I was like, had to have this thing teach it to me. But again, it is such an incredible tool. And all of it, and anyone listening to your podcast knows how transformative it's going to be as a tool, and particularly for teaching and all those kinds of things. But it was another one of those amazing moments where it was really helping me express myself, understand my own ideas, create something special that hadn't existed before. And I was really impressed by its ability to, I had loaded it with a ton of content, and its ability to scrape through it and parse and pull out what was valuable. And the way that the interaction was structuring itself to clarify points and add emphasis. And the other thing about it too, especially if you're a solo creative, and, you know, even for any writers, like, we're constantly getting shit on and constantly getting critiqued, and everybody thinks they're a writer and everybody's got a take. And it's just so wonderful to be able to get feedback that is helpful and supportive and not critical, doesn't have an agenda, doesn't carry an ego or any kind of intensity. So the feedback on my material that I get from AI has always been so helpful. In ways that often you don't get from real humans. And the few times that I've used it as therapy, it's been the same, right? It's been the same kind of really positive and supportive feedback. So it's clear that's another arena where it's going to be incredibly effective, is personalized coaching, therapy, again, teaching, all those types of interactions are going to be really positive.
And that the teaching piece is interesting to me, since I've done some, and it was enlightening, specifically NotebookLM, in hearing two other voices wrestling with something that you've given it, where you can start to feel like, okay, it's like having students talk about something, and it's like your understanding is incomplete because maybe I didn't convey enough. You're wrestling with it. You're seeing the good in it. And I like hearing that. That's lovely. But you're kind of hanging on their every word. Like, what did you like about it? And how was it working? Clearly, there's some gaps, there where you don't seem to understand what I was going for. And that's fine. I can build off of that. But hearing these voices talk about it, it's just enlightening.
Yeah. And they have to make choices too. Like, that's another thing, is that I tend to be really wonky. I tend to overwrite. It's tough. Like, when I started my career writing spec features, my writing was super lean and really tight and confident. And then just over time, and based on some of the different requirements from showrunners, it started to get this bloat. So what's nice about the AI is it has to make choice about what to emphasize and consider. And that's really helpful. When I've created pages and pages and pages of notes and stuff, to be able to have it go through and pull out what's really important is valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. We've gone from a world where I was working on a video game and the contract we signed said you're not allowed to use AI, to the one I'm working on now, where it's like, embrace it and see the possibilities. And I went through an experiment like you, where I dusted off an old TV idea. I've mentioned it on a couple of these podcasts now, but so anyone listening, forgive me for repeating myself. And it was like, I want to see how good the tools are right now. And I had so much research on this thing because it was involving life after death and all of that, and looking at, the spiritual as well as pop culture. And I just fed it all. And its ability to distill with some clarity about what's working and what's not is very powerful. One part of that, and you touched on this, and it's at the heart of some of your other writing, is that ability to discern, that your ability to be the orchestra conductor is born of having toiled for decades. And I know it hurts to say, we're all there, but that it is born of practice, investment, caring, all the hard work. And I don't know about you, I certainly have had that guilty feeling where it's been easy. There's still a wrestling with the ideas, but it's like there's this ease that comes with idea generation, working with the various models and getting to a place faster than I would have just on my own. But that ability to discern, like, this is working, this is not, because I've wrestled with story for so long. I'm curious. And again, you were exploring this and you realize when it's working. And how about the natives? Like, we grew up with the Apple II and we got to figure things out. Kids in between had YouTube to figure things out. Now they have AI. The next generation of writers, and you actually wrote about this in a blog, that the mid-tier writers are getting squeezed. What does the next generation of writers look like when these are the tools?
I have no idea. Honestly, I really don't know. I think there's so much change and so much upheaval. And, I am grateful that I am at the end of my career versus the middle, for sure, because you just can't, just on the economics of it, you can't make a living doing what I do and doing what I used to do. And it just isn't economically feasible to be a writer professionally in the way that it used to be, where you are working for an organization that has a bunch of writers, some who are more experienced that you can learn from, and some who are at your level that you can collaborate with, really grow your writing and your knowledge of writing as a community IRL, is, as well as having it something great I really thought was great, was having, certainly for TV, the structure of, we need to do this by this hour and it needs to fit this very specific requirement of budget. And so you would develop a real professional craft through experience. And without that, it's just going to be super different. So I have a son who's in his first year of film school at the Savannah College of Art and Design, and his industry is going to be very different from what mine was. And he will really need to be his own writer, director, producer, all of that stuff by himself. And he's really going to need to figure out how to make his own things, whatever those things are. He's going to need to learn how to make his own things and not have the expectation that he'll be able to get a job working for somebody else making those things or doing those things in the same way that I did. And certainly there's no way that, anyone will be able to. There was a very beautiful window in Hollywood where it was an ad-supported model for television writers, and we were paid incredibly well because the studios needed content on a very specific schedule. But it was only it was a model that was economically driven. It wasn't based on, we need things to be good and writers are amazing. It was like, that's so much bullshit, and there's so much weird lack of memory with a lot of the current generation of writers. They just don't realize, hey, we're the thing that came between the commercials. We have no leverage, guys. As soon as it went to streaming, we lost our leverage. So that certainly the TV business is dead. And the reason I got into TV from movies is because the writer in movies, you're just an expendable stenographer unless you're like one of 20 top people. So that, if you're trying to make it in that system, you're kind of doomed to poverty. And yet there's so much opportunity with all these tools now to make your own movies and make your own podcasts and make your own audio dramas. And if you want, do your own books, as we're seeing, self-publish your own books. And there's so much opportunity for people to make stuff, but a lot of it is they're going to need to figure it out on their own and figure it out together. And so I really have no idea what it's going to look like.
Well, it's interesting that you highlight there one of the central tensions that people have been talking about when I've had these conversations, which is, on the one hand, the system feels like it's breaking down, that these systems where people could come up through, learn the skills, is paired with the incredible power of the tool, the ability to create as an individual. I was talking to a director. He's a writer, director, producer, and he's pulling in all the various parts, using all the various tools, and he's at the center of it all. And with speed and efficiency and lower cost, he can pull something together. But again, this is after, a couple of decades of honing his craft. And so now he can use the tool, having been taught and been an apprentice, and not having that. And I think you touched on this in one of your blogs, the idea of the centrality and the need for true visionaries. There's still a need for that human piece of things. There's some things, at least now, the example you mentioned, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and the example I always point to is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. If AI spits out a Charlie Kaufman script, then we're all doomed.
But that's an interesting thing, because a lot of people, what's nice is, because my pursuit is creative pursuit and it's not fact-based, when the AI hallucinates, that's awesome, right? So, and the hallucinations are kind of creativity. So it feels like it's certainly not spitting out a Charlie Kaufman script, but it spits out content that is Kaufman-esque, right? Because it is having these, what they call hallucinations, which really are kind of creativity, where you're putting together sort of these random ideas that don't seemingly go together. It's there, there's one thing, there's a filmmaker who I love who is on YouTube, this guy, Joel Haver, and he is an independent filmmaker, is in his late 20s, and he did an amazing experiment last year where he made 12 movies in 12 months, features, and they're awesome. And the reality of it is, and even Orson Welles talks about it when you see it in interviews, you can figure it out, right? It's really not that freaking hard. The main thing is you just have to do it, and you have to do it a lot and do it over and over again to learn how to do it. And the current generation is so media savvy. They've seen so much content. They've, had conversations about so much content that a lot of them really intuitively could do a great job. The real trick is who are going to be the ones who do it, right? Who execute on it, who have the discipline, who can turn off the distractions and find the time to do the deep work. For me, I was lucky that there wasn't broadband or Netflix when I was starting my career, and I was pretty aggressive. I didn't have a TV in my apartment. I had a TV, but it was connected to a Laserdisc player, and that was it. So I couldn't watch TV. I would have to walk down to Blockbuster and rent a movie. I didn't have any distractions, and I just focused on my craft like a monk. I would just get out of bed and I would just sort of, first thing in the morning, would just go over to my computer and just start writing. And I just cranked out spec screenplays. And each one I did, I would learn something new and learn a little bit more. I think that is something that will separate those who have success, and it already does, from those who don't, is who's making stuff, who's putting stuff out there, who's learning from it, who's iterating on it. That's the key, is just figure out how you can stay focused and not be pulled in a million different directions by streaming services and social media and crazy politics stuff that's never going to affect you. It's just focus on your work, skills acquisition, find a way that you can generate revenue so that you don't have to be a charity. If you want to save the world, you can earn money and give it away, which so many people do. It is just focusing on developing yourself. And that's another thing too, that I always thought of myself as the end product. I never was this is my one perfect script. It was no, I want to be the best writer that I can be. And to do that, I need to go to the gym every day. And that gym is writing. And I just need to do a lot of it and think about it all the time and immerse myself in it. And that, was my approach. Now I'm at the point, right? So the last couple of years, I've been pretty immersed into this AI stuff, where now I feel like I'm kind of at the point where I grok it to where I can make stuff using these different tools pretty organically, and find spaces in the tools where I can add value and I can participate. And it's not about the output of the tool. It's about what I do with that output, or how I use that tool to so it's really just a lot. People just have to make shit. You just got to make shit. You got to make a lot of it over and over and over again. And you can't care what anyone thinks. As long as you know you put effort into it, that's all that counts.
I think we have our title for the episode, Make Shit.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. And it's a beautiful and hopeful place to leave this, because sometimes when we talk about, this kind of thing, it's like people are worried about being replaced. And I like the hopeful moments where, and just that viewpoint, that perspective, that these tools are there to be used, experiment, do the very human thing of go out and create, make shit. That's what it's empowering. It's beautiful. It's what I tell my son, who is in college right now, who pushes AI away because he wants to make music. And it's like, great. You're creating. If you are a creator in this world, you will be much happier for it and a better person for it, as you said. So again, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. Anyone who is listening to this has gotten a ton out of it. I know I have. Again, I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Andy. And if anybody's interested, they can go to scribblejerk.com, which is my blog, but it really is just sort of a dumping ground for ideas and experiments. So just take it for what it is. And if there's stuff there that's helpful, awesome. And if there isn't, ignore it.
Yeah, and I certainly can back it up for anyone who's listening. I went down the rabbit hole, because often you'll read a few blog posts by somebody, but it was like, okay, now there's another one. Now there's another one. And going further and further back, where it's like you can see some of the evolution of thought. Check it out, read it. You will learn a lot. I know I did. All right. So again, thank you very much. And I hope I get to talk to you again soon.
Great. Thanks a lot, Andy.